Genesis 6 says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also after. This is our vision of what that actually looked like, built for our upcoming series, NEPHILIM Bounty. And what you're about to see next is real. Glen, on location, walking you through exactly how big they really were.
Giants weren't a myth. The Bible names them. The only question left is how big they actually got. Let's find out. Hey Quinn, it is so good to see you.
Glen, since NEPHILIM Bounty started, this is the question we get more than any other. How big were they really? Not the Sunday school version, the actual answer.
This is something that we're not talking about very often in our churches. We're not talking about it in our Sunday school, but it is something that people bring up with a lot of interest. Well, before we talk about the sizes, we have to step back a little bit and talk about where they came from.
Okay, so before we get into the sizes, we need to talk about where these things actually came from, because that changes everything.
So if we go back to the beginning, the very beginning, before there were giants, before there were Nephilim even, there were the Watchers. These Watchers are described as fallen angels. They're angels that rebelled against God and they fell to the earth and they chose to leave their heavenly realm and come down to earth. But here's something that I think a lot of people get wrong. They picture these Watchers as these terrifying demonic creatures. And while I have no doubt that they were demons, I don't see them as something that was monstrous falling from the sky, and that's not what the text describes. It describes these Watchers who could shapeshift, they could present themselves at human scale, and they were probably quite beautiful, quite charming, luminous, glowing, commanding. Now, the daughters of men, they wouldn't have been frightened of these creatures. In fact, they probably would have been intrigued and even attracted by them. They would have known the names of all the people on earth. They would have gone to public places. They're not in hiding. These were essentially what would have been seen as gods in the world. And they were carrying a forbidden knowledge with them as a gift. Well, as it turns out, the Book of Enoch and Genesis as well says that those Watchers took wives among the daughters of men. And as they took these wives and had these children, they would have taught them things that humans really weren't supposed to know. Things like metallurgy and astronomy, how to do agriculture. They advanced the human population's knowledge way faster than what it could have advanced on its own, which is what allowed us to build these great structures that we're finding in archaeology today. And these children, we call them the ancients, they were born of these Watchers and these human women. And the result was something that the earth had never seen. The offspring weren't necessarily uniform. One is going to pick up more of the divine, one is going to pick up more of the humans. And some are going to be enormous and radiant and beautiful, and others are going to be more human. So I believe we would have had some that were larger, some massive giants. We would have also had some that were smaller and more recognizable and able to walk among men. But essentially what's going to happen, you're going to have this mix of different bloodlines, and some of them are going to take human wives, others are going to take Nephilim wives. And this divine DNA is going to begin to dilute and spread throughout the population. And so each generation of these Nephilim are going to become more recognizable. And it's going to continue to dilute until one day you get a species that can walk through a city.
Here's where it gets controversial. Because a lot of people hear God sent a flood to wipe out the earth, and they use that to attack his character entirely. Glen, how do you respond to that?
And this is something that a lot of non-Christians, I think, get tripped up on. And a lot of people, they use that as a way to cast shade on God, say that he wasn't all that loving, he killed innocent people. Why would a loving God kill all these innocent people? But what they missed, in my opinion, was what actually happened and why the flood was sent. And this is vital to understanding the Nephilim and the Nephilim bloodline. What was happening during this time was the human genome was actually being overwritten. It was generation by generation, this Nephilim bloodline and the human bloodline were mixing throughout the population of the earth. And if it was completed, if every human on earth got to a point where they had this, half Nephilim, half human bloodline, then the promise that God made to Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis could never occur. And that promise would have died with Eden. There would be no Messiah. There would be no redemption. So with that in mind,
Noah really wasn't saved because he was morally perfect. No one's been morally perfect. The Hebrew word that was used to describe him, tamim, it meant pure within the generations. And that meant that his bloodline was uncontaminated, and that is why his family was saved.
So this flood was meant to destroy the corruption at that time, but more importantly, I believe that it was meant to cleanse the bloodline of this Nephilim infestation that had happened to humanity. And in the end, it was really the most effective and surgical way to clean that bloodline.
So walk us through the tiers. You keep referencing different generations. Let's actually break this down, starting with the biggest.
The answer really depends on which Nephilim we're talking about. Now, anybody who knows anything about the Nephilim at all, when they start talking about the heights of them, they start quoting the Book of Enoch, specifically in chapter 7, where it says the Nephilim are 300 cubits tall. Well, a cubit is approximately 18 inches. So if you start to do the math on that, that's 450 feet, which is taller than a 40-story building. These were massive creatures, according to Enoch. These beings didn't walk through the world at the time. They walked over it.
Okay, Glenn, it's time to head up. Let's see what we're actually dealing with.
It was massive, absolutely massive. So for context, you would be essentially the size of an ant. And those creatures wouldn't be looking at you. To them, you wouldn't even exist. If you look at the Greek traditions, they had their own name for what we would call the Nephilim. And this generation specifically, they would have called them the Titans. But if you look at who the Titans were, they were born of the sky and the earth, and they were ruling the world even before the gods that came through to Olympus. And they were overthrown in this catastrophic war and then cast out into the abyss. Look at the stories about Atlas and Hercules and Perseus, these Greek gods. They were all half divine and half human. Hercules was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman. And the same with the Perseus, Atlas, all of these demigods were, according to the Greek tradition, half divine and half human. And the Greek remember them as gods, but that was the story that these beings would have told about themselves. So what's described to us in Genesis 6 really is a similar story if we presume these ancients, as we're calling them in the movie, are related to the Titans. And we look at the crossover in stories, there's really a certain amount of similarity there where the Greeks are preserving that memory through stories, whereas the Hebrews preserve more of theology. And in the NEPHILIM Bounty, we're going to explore both.
That's the textual case, the ancient stories. But some people need more than that. They want something physical, something they can actually point to.
Here's what gets me. All over the world, on nearly every single continent, there are rock formations that don't look like rocks at all. Islands off the coast of Malta, cliffs in Iceland, mesas in Oregon, towers in Wyoming, stone pillars in Russia, a mountain standing over Rio de Janeiro. They look like giant animals, giant faces, tree stumps the size of buildings or larger, organic shapes frozen in stone.
Yeah, maybe they're just rocks. Maybe that's all there is. But these things keep showing up all over the world, and nobody really has a satisfying answer as to why they look so much like humanoid beings, so much like animals, so much like trees. And really, I'm not here to tell you what to believe or what not to believe. I'm here to ask the questions that these texts have been asking for thousands of years.
They will know where they came from. We know how big the originals were. We've got the texts, we've got the physical evidence, and it all points to something that walked this earth that we can barely imagine. But here's what most people miss. The story doesn't end with the flood. The bloodline survived. And in part 2, we follow it all the way to Goliath. And then somewhere, the biblical record goes quiet, and the trail gets very interesting. Part 2, dropping soon. Subscribe so you don't miss it.